Now, is this a book that will be published simultaneously in English and in Spanish?
Well, Palgrave is only an English language publisher, so we won't be publishing it in Spanish as well.
We've been talking with Michelle Fitzgerald of Palgrave Macmillan. We're here at Book Expo America, which is the book publishing industry's annual convention in New York City.
You're watching an interview from Book TV's recent trip to New York City for Book Expo America, the publishing industry's annual trade show. For more information, visit bookexpoamerica.com. And now on Book TV, Gary Weiss explores the political and social ideologies of Ayn Rand, author of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. This is about 50 minutes.
Well, Marta, thank you very much for that very warm and very flattering introduction. It's actually very interesting if you listen very carefully to Marta's introduction. You will notice that, and you might even ask yourself, why did I write a book about Ayn Rand? Because after all, I'm not a philosophy professor, and nor am I an economist. And of course, these are the areas in which Ayn Rand was best known. She was a philosopher. I mean, I know there are some people who say that she wasn't, but she was a philosopher. And she very heavily influenced, economic thought, economic and political thought. My background is in writing about Wall Street, and in particular, the underside of Wall Street. And what got me interested in Rand was right around the time of the 2008 financial crisis. I was writing an article on Alan Greenspan. Actually, it wasn't on Alan Greenspan. It was on Timothy Geithner, who was head of the New York Fed. And one of Timothy Geithner's major influences was Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan was one of his mentors and one of his closest associates. And in the course of my research for that article, I found a photograph of Greenspan being sworn in as head of the Council of Economic Advisors in 1974. And standing right there, this was in the Oval Office, and standing right there was Ayn Rand. And it really fascinated me because, Ayn Rand, I never really thought that Ayn Rand was, quite that central to our political belief system. But as I began to, carry out research, I began to realize how important Rand was and how important Rand is in a number of areas. And in the area that interested me the most around 2008, I started to look into the financial crisis. In particular, I was trying to look into, sort of the whys of the financial crisis. Why did the people who were sort of the actors, the main actors in the financial crisis, why did they behave as they did? I'd always written, as Marta pointed out, I've written 2 books about Wall Street. One was about the mafia on Wall Street, and the other was about, called Wall Street versus America. It was about greed on Wall Street. And that's always been something that I've looked at. I've been reporting on this for a good 20 years for Business Week, and most recently also for Portfolio. And I was very interested to find out, what is the ideology? There's an ideology behind the greed and the selfishness that we saw sort of explode in 2008, which has been with us to the current day. And that brings me back to this this photograph of Greenspan and Ayn Rand appearing in the book. I think what I'd like to do is maybe read from perhaps the introduction to the book, in which I get into a little bit, why how I got involved in Rand and in particular the Greenspan connection, which I also deal with in the book. It was early in 2009, and the horror of the financial crisis was fully evident. The shock had worn off, but little else. The hunt for villains was in full swing. I was researching a magazine article on Timothy Geithner, the recently appointed Treasury Secretary, when I found an old photo that I thought might be a good illustration for the piece. It showed his most eminent mentor, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, posing in the White House with Gerald Ford and 3 other people. The photo was taken in September 1974 when Greenspan had just been sworn in to his first major government post, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Standing next to Greenspan was a woman of about 70. I had seen her on a book jacket, younger but no less imperious, and always with a short page boy haircut. In her televised appearances, she spoke with a Russian accent and was always precise, forming her words carefully as if she had written them down beforehand. Ayn Rand was a figure from yesterday. I never had any reason to write about her. In my many years as a reporter covering Wall Street, mostly its underside, she was always on someone else's beat. She inhabited a vague intersection of literature, philosophy, economics, and politics, far-right politics. My focus was at the greed beat, and her theories, I thought, had no relevancy. I was wrong, and to make matters worse, I was wrong for a long time. Looking at that photo in 2009, I realized that Rand provided the missing piece of a puzzle I had never thought about very deeply, about the why of it all, the moral component of the behavior to which we had all been exposed. Why did legitimate, essentially honest financiers, traders, and CEOs pursue monetary acquisition with such a single-minded intensity, regardless of consequences to others? What motivated the regulators and government officials who abetted them? The usual explanations were glib: greed, status, and power, with regulatory capture sometimes thrown in to explain government inaction. But these explanations did not seem adequate. I saw a pattern of behavior in the actions and utterances of the main actors in the financial crisis. I saw it in the downfall of John Thain, the plain-spoken and supremely efficient Midwesterner who was the supposed rescuer of Merrill Lynch. To the public, thanks to his well-oiled publicity machine, he was Thain the brain, the human calculator, a man of unquestioned integrity. Today, he's mainly known for the $35,000 commode that he bought for his office until shareholders objected. I saw it in John Paulson, the hedge fund manager who collaborated with Goldman Sachs in designing a financial instrument pegged to subprime mortgages that was as profitable for him as it was devastating for Goldman clients. Paulson was a brilliant man who could see the financial system racing to a precipice. Unlike other hedge fund managers who sounded the alarm and were pilloried as a result, Paulson placed his bets and kept silent, cashing in his chips when the system nearly collapsed. In talking with Paulson, I came away with the impression that he had devoted his life to one goal: the acquisition of an ever larger sum of money. The Goldman Sachs deal was the culmination of this single-minded quest. What made these two accomplishments so selfish? What made these two accomplishments so selfish, so seemingly amoral, so lacking in public spiritedness, so thirsty for a buck? These two men, and many others, personified a philosophy. Whether it was explicitly adopted or implicit is not important. What mattered was that they lived it. This underlying unspoken philosophy was reflected in the belief, continually promulgated by Greenspan at the Fed, that the markets were supreme, a kind of fifth estate. It was an attitude toward life that pervaded the financial system and was accepted, sometimes with considerable enthusiasm, by regulators in Congress, in all administrations, and a sizable portion of the media. At first, I developed a theory that this was a hodgepodge of beliefs, which I called market supremacy. But it was brought home to me by the Greenspan photograph from 1974 that this philosophy of greed had a philosopher. Ayn Rand had been there all along, and I never noticed. This book is my attempt to correct that oversight. My purpose in writing this book was not to tell the story of Rand's life or to recount again the much-told tale of the financial crisis. That has been skillfully depicted in numerous fine histories in the final report of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. Rand's story was thoroughly explored in 2 biographies. It's all history now. Yet the failure of deregulation and untrammeled capitalism doesn't seem to matter anymore. What followed the financial crisis was not reform, but retrenchment, rebuttal, denial. Led by Jamie Dimon, the outspoken chief executive of J.P. Morgan Chase, Wall Street struck back against the very idea of reining in its compensation and any curbs on its ability to freely transact business regardless of societal risk. Little reform was enacted, and what was passed into law was undermined in Congress. Even talking about such things, blaming bankers for the things they had done, was to be condemned. Greenspan went on the talk show circuit, the oracle as in days of old, arguing that regulation was not the answer, though it was all in the spirit, through it all, was the spirit of the lady who stood next to Greenspan in that photograph almost 4 decades ago, Ayn Rand, triumphant, the first lady of the politics of reaction. Rand has experienced an extraordinary revival since the financial crisis, and nothing seems to be stopping her. It is a struggle for the soul of America, and she is winning. She is winning because she is not considered to be very important. She is dismissed by entire segments of informed opinion as a fringe character, a nut, a cultist, and an extremist. She is ridiculed, not analyzed, engaged, or rebutted. Yet she was an extremist. But she matters because her extremism is no longer on the fringe. Her followers call her a serious philosopher. Some call her the greatest philosopher who ever lived. Some call her the greatest writer who ever lived, and her novel Atlas Shrugged the greatest novel ever written. Her detractors call her a charlatan whose teachings are simple-minded, morally repugnant, and derivative. They deny that she was a philosopher at all, or that her ideology is a philosophy. In this book, I utilize the term. To deny it, I think, unwisely minimizes her considerable influence. What's indisputable is that Ayn Rand was a novelist, playwright, essayist, and screenwriter. All those roles were secondary to her objective in life, which was to advance the cause of the most radical form of free market, laissez-faire capitalism. She called herself a radical for capitalism. In Rand, capitalism and freedom were synonymous, as were government and force. She advanced a system of beliefs that turned the moral values of Western civilization upside down. Bad was good, the immoral was laudatory, and the laudatory was evil. She believed in individualism and opposed the institutions of society that benefited groups of people, which she condemned as the evil of collectivism. Every man was an island in the parallel universe of her ideas. Being selfish, pursuing one's rational self-interest, was the only truly ethical form of existence. To be selfless was evil. She used that term very often. Rand periodically intruded to the political scene from the 1930s to the 1980s. She was a font of political incorrectness, and her positions seemed almost maniacally inconsistent. She opposed U.S. entry into World War II and supported Israel. She opposed the Vietnam War and thought Dwight D. Eisenhower was soft on communism. She endorsed Barry Goldwater and opposed Ronald Reagan because he catered to the Christian right. She opposed racism and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. She believed that big business was a persecuted minority, but did not speak out when big business discriminated against real minorities, including the one to which she belonged. She despised hippies and the draft. She was an elitist who adored Mickey Spillane. She was a fierce advocate of individualism, and her heroes were indifferent to criticism. Yet, she fell into a deep depression when her final and grandest novel, Atlas Shrugged, was critically skewered. She called the philosophy that she invented objectivism. To Rand and her disciples, an objectivist world would be a triumph of energy, productivity, and justice. Freedom would sweep the halls of power and the boudoir alike. Nagging relatives would be thrown out of the house. Marriage vows would be optional, just as they were for Rand and her squalid private life. Government would be reduced to 3 functions: the armed services, the police, and the courts. Income taxes would end, and so would everything the taxes paid for. Today, her vision of radical capitalism has never been more popular. She is the godmother of the Tea Party and the philosophical bulwark that stands behind the right's assault on Social Security and Medicare. Yet during her lifetime, she was the leader of a cult, an adulterer, a militant atheist, a supporter of abortion, and an opponent of anti-drug laws. Rand could be abysmally ignorant of basic facts and eerily prescient. She had an uncanny grasp of the American psyche. Yet, her books showed little insight into the lives of ordinary Americans. Her most prominent critic was not a bleeding heart liberal, but the patrician leader of the conservative movement, William F. Buckley, Jr. He was appalled. He was so appalled by her rejection of Christian morality that he assigned the turncoat former communist Whittaker Chambers to write a scathing review of Atlas Shrugged for the National Review. Quote, "Since a great many of us disliked what Miss Rand dislikes," Chambers said, "quite as heartily as she does, many inclined to take her at her word," said Chambers. In fact, he said, her vision was hateful and repulsive. From any page of Atlas Shrugged, Chambers said, a voice can be heard from painful necessity commanding to a gas chamber go. Washington Post said in a review of Atlas Shrugged, "This is a story of conflict where it's equally easy to hate both sides. It howls in its reader's ear and beats him about the head in order to secure his attention, and then, when it has him subdued, harangues him for page after page," said the New York Times book review critic Granville Hicks. Despite the scathing reviews, Atlas Shrugged sold in the millions and remains a bestseller to this day. Its biggest sale year recently was, I believe, 2009. I think it sold something like a half million copies. Hugely successful book. Two major novels are thematically very different. The Fountainhead, the 1943 novel that made her a success, says hardly a word about capitalism. The novel's principal character lives like a pauper, doesn't even like money. That's something you don't hear very much about from objectivists. Howard Roark, who was played by Cary Cooper in the movie, he didn't like money. Atlas Shrugged, on the other hand, published in 1957, is entirely focused on her ideal of no regulation, no controls, no government capitalism. Its heroes are ostentatiously rich. Rand had always favored radical capitalism, but her practical knowledge of economics and industry was lacking. There was a missing ingredient that Rand found after she wrote Fountainhead. Its name was Alan Greenspan. Greenspan was her loyal acolyte since the early 1950s. He was a member of her inner circle, the collective, that met every week and served as what today we would call a writer's group, reading Atlas Shrugged chapters and acting as a sounding board for her ideas. As the collective disintegrated over the years, shredded by purges and defections, he never abandoned her, never doubted her, even as others did, no matter how erratic her behavior. During the 1960s and 1970s, Ayn Rand was shunned by mainstream intellectuals in academia. Her reputation wasn't bad, it was toxic. Writing in 1972, William F. O'Neill, a philosophy professor at the University of Southern California, and author of one of the few serious Rand critiques, said that writing about Ayn Rand was a treacherous undertaking. In most intellectual circles, she is either totally ignored or simply dismissed out of hand, and those who take her seriously enough to examine her point of view frequently place themselves in grave danger of guilt by association. Rand had few friends even on the far right. Her FBI file discloses that J. Edgar Hoover, on the advice of a subordinate, rebuffed her request for an appointment in 1966 to discuss an unspecified personal political problem, which we still don't know what it is to this day. Standing in the Oval Office on that late summer day in 1974 with Greenspan next to her, Rand was still isolated, still an extremist, and had never softened her views. But thanks to Greenspan, she was now posing with the President of the United States. She would come again to the White House 2 years later, when another acolyte named Malcolm Fraser, the Prime Minister of Australia, paid a visit. She rarely strayed from her apartment in New York City, emerging occasionally to give lectures. During her final years, she became a fussy and bitter old woman, shuffling around her neighborhood in a housecoat. The contrast with Ayn Rand's import and influence today could not be more dramatic. She is the darling of the conservative media and a mighty force on the internet. Small groups of the faithful congregate on Rand blogs, Rand newsletters, Rand message board, and even a Rand Echo-like dating service. Rand is the new Benjamin Franklin. Her pithy sayings, trumpeted by the right, a humorless Will Rogers in reverse, who knew few people she didn't dislike. An inspiration for leading political figures, her followers meet regularly throughout the country. And her novels, once shunned by academia, are now taught in colleges and even high schools, thanks to free books provided by wealthy supporters and the Ayn Rand Institute, founded after her death to perpetuate her legacy. Rand does not need the ARI. Her novels were on the bedstands of the baby boom long before it was founded, just as she enthralled the silent generation and went on to thrill Generation X and today's collegians. Her novels became a post-war American cliché, a universal teenage reading experience like Catcher in the Rye. The Rand-loving advertising executive in Mad Men is a reflection of two Rand crazes, the one that took place on a small scale in the 1960s when she was a fringe cult figure, and the one that is taking place with considerable more impact today. In 1975, Stanley Marcus, chairman of Neiman Marcus in Dallas, decried corporate obstruction of social legislation. Who among the business community today, he asked, would seriously propose that Congress repeal our child labor laws, or the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Federal Reserve Act, the Securities Exchange Act, or workmen's compensation, or Social Security, or minimum wage, or Medicare, or civil rights legislation? All of us today, he said, recognize such legislation is an integral part of our system, that it has made us stronger. That may have been true in 1975, but not today. The credit or blame lies squarely with Ayn Rand. So I've just read a bit from the foreword of the book, and I think that Alan Greenspan, if you look at all of the political figures out there, the one who I think is widely believed to have had the greatest influence of all, if you could cite a single person who had the greatest influence on government in the 1990s, it would have been Alan Greenspan as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Not only did he set monetary policy, he was also a regulator and also an advocate of deregulation. I think it's fair to say that he was the nation's leading advocate of deregulation. And one of the things that I get into in the book is how Alan Greenspan never really changed his stripes. You know, he was an acolyte of Ayn Rand in the 1950s. He was a member of her inner circle. And one of the things I get into, and I don't have time to read it, I don't think, but one of the things I get into is his famous mea culpa speech from 2008, where he appeared before Henry Waxman's committee, and he said, that there was a flaw in the mindset. I was terribly surprised that we had all these problems. I thought that just the self-interest of bankers and of business would be sufficient to prevent abuses from happening, and I was terribly shocked when that happened. And in actuality, he did say that, but I think that if you bring that comment into context with all of his other comments at that time, as well as the statements that he made before the committee, you find that, in fact, Greenspan never really apologized for anything. He never really repudiated Rand. That was, I think, what was really more of a public relations gesture. And in fact, he later on in his testimony before the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, he did what they call on Wall Street a DK. He didn't know. He was asked about his comments before Waxman's committee in 2008, and he made believe that he didn't do it. He says, well, I was really talking about something else. I wasn't repudiating my worldview. So it's really, I think, amazing, and I think to a certain extent that the number one advocate of Rand's views, the main proponent of deregulation, who I believe over the years never really strayed from her views in any substantive way, actually would have the gall to make this widely publicized PR gesture in 2008 and then deny ever having done it. There's a quote that I have in the book. It's actually from Nathaniel Branden, who was one of her leading acolytes. And Nathaniel Branden I think, made a very interesting comment. Nathaniel Branden said, "Today it seems painfully obvious that if respect for reality was the ultimate objectivist virtue, it was not one we practiced consistently, and it was inevitable that one day reality would present a bill for collection." And I think that's a very important quote, and I think it's fair to say that sort of the current economic agony that we're currently suffering under is to, I think, to a very large extent, I think that's the bill for collection, and I think we're all paying it. So thanks very much, and I'm willing to take some questions. That's it.
Thank you very much. I guess I got involved with Ayn Rand in the me generation, which was sort of funny. Branden went around and had institutes and stuff. But I'm interested, if you want to bring it up to date now, that Paul Ryan is probably the biggest one now on the scene, and he, confronted by his god-awful plan for the budget, had to refute her the other day and said that because the Catholic bishops went up against her, against him, saying, you know, your plan is more like Ayn Rand than the what we want to do.
Yeah.
And it was always her contradictions, but that whole selfishness that was the objectivism that the psychology movement had about her, that only you don't care about poverty or issues. And I'm wondering what you know about what Paul Ryan is up to, because he's still pushing the same plan that is full of it. And then Rand Paul, yeah.
Politicians, what politicians do with Ayn Rand is that many of them really love her tremendously, and Paul Ryan is a superb example. Paul Ryan appeared at a gathering of the Atlas Society, which is one of the Rand groups that I talk about in the book, and he gave this glowing endorsement of Ayn Rand. Recently, he was occasionally quoted from it. I quote him in the book from the comments that he made. And then recently he just denied it. He says, "Oh, it's just an urban legend. I never really said that. I'm not a Rand acolyte, whatever." Well, it so happens that the Atlas Society had a tape of his comments. And they played it. And I actually wrote an article or something on that, and so did a lot of other people. I mean, he was just fibbing. You know, it's like that. It's like that quote I just read from Branden. You know, the bill for collection, the tendency to what was the words he used? The tendency to respect for reality was the ultimate objectivist virtue. It was not one we practiced. You know, and that's what he just lied about it. He just lied about it. It's interesting. You should mention that. But the reason he did, it's very important though to understand why he lied about it. The reason is that it's more than just if you endorse Ayn Rand quite the way he did in such a glowing way, you're kind of endorsing you're endorsing a philosopher who, well, first of all, she favored abortion, which puts her, at loggerheads with a great deal of people in the conservative movement. But she was also, in a very broad sense, she was opposed to, the fundamentals of Judeo-Christian morality. She was opposed to altruism. She felt that altruism was evil. And this is contrary to what people are taught in Sunday school. You just can't say. He absolutely had to disavow her.
Mr. Weiss, thanks for speaking with us today. You mentioned the photo with Gerald Ford swearing in and Ayn Rand swearing in Alan Greenspan, but that was actually for the Council of Economic Advisors.
Yes.
He was the chairman. So he didn't become chairman of the Federal Reserve till 1987, which was after Miss Rand's death.
That's right.
So did you look at all at comparing the actual actions of Mr. Greenspan once he became chairman of the Federal Reserve to the ideas of Ayn Rand, rather than just associating him historically with her, because she had no opportunity to distance herself from him once he was the top regulator, according to you?
Well, he actually in the book I do get into quite a bit of detail on Rand on Greenspan's. I actually have 2 chapters devoted to Greenspan, and I think the crucial thing with Greenspan is that he, I call him the term that I use, which might be considered somewhat derogatory, is the Murray Hill candidate. You know, he acted, you know, whenever it was necessary. You know, he wasn't, you know, 100% of the time. He was head of, after all, of the central bank. But as a regulator, at crucial times, he was always out there pushing the role of deregulation. He was the most committed opponent of regulation in or out of government, most influential. He was the oracle. The most, I think, vivid example of Greenspan as an opponent of regulation was when he opposed regulation of derivatives. He combined with Arthur Levitt and other regulators, actually came down on Brooklyn Bourne, who was head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, when she wanted to impose regulations on over-the-counter derivatives. Now, if over-the-counter derivatives had been regulated, if they'd come under the regulatory scheme, it's certainly, I think, we might have had the financial crisis. It wouldn't be quite as bad as it currently is.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the confusion I feel about Alan Greenspan with Ayn Rand, I see them as two separate people who come from completely different lives. So I think of Alan Greenspan as somebody who did have scruples at one point, but his owners at some point told him otherwise. So I think he changed. I don't think that her message has changed at all. I think Alan Greenspan, something changed somewhere along the line in his life. I can't say I've ever read her books, but I have seen her interviews and read her philosophy. And I guess if I was to write a book about her, I would compare it to actually the law of attraction, the secret spirituality of today, where we are taught that we are, those of us who are secular and really don't have religion and want to be more spiritual, start from the point of view that we are all selfishly wired. That's how we're created by design. And it actually gets you to a point where you actually have a more agnostic belief at some point rather than an atheistic belief. And once you become a whole person, as her words are no different to me than the New Age teachers of today that tell you basically.
Well, yeah, I think that you raise a very good point. I mean, she stayed the same. Alan Greenspan changed when he became a member of the collective. He really had no major beliefs, no major economic beliefs. He was sort of an empty slate, and he became a convinced objectivist. He was such a convinced objectivist that, in fact, he wrote several essays for her book. Actually, it's a collection of essays. He wrote essays for the Objectivist newsletter. And which were published by Rand. So these were, basically Rand authorized, expressing the thoughts of Rand, which were published in a book called Capitalism: The Unknown Ideal, which is in print today and is a very big seller. And he's never disavowed anything he wrote for Rand. He has never requested that the essays that he wrote for Capitalism: The Unknown Ideal, that they be removed from that anthology. Or that, and in his memoirs, speaking about his evolution as a Randian, in his memoirs he does distance himself from the Rand movement, and he sort of vaguely disavows his Rand's views, in sort of in a vague, sort of a more of a hint, but. He never disavowed her in any sort of substantive way, and his words speak for themselves. His words in Capitalism: The Unknown Ideal speak for themselves. He was opposed to any form of regulation. He was even opposed to building codes. He felt that building codes, the way he put it is regulation undermines, I don't have it in front of me, but I believe words to the effect that regulation undermines the moral basis of capitalism, I think was the words he used, but I don't have it in front of me. He felt that that if you have regulations that all that you'll see is that he felt that the free market was sufficient instead of building code. The free market could supplant building codes, and as I point out in the book, when you've had a free market, when you haven't had strict building codes, buildings collapse. People die in fires. The free market has been proven as incapable of regulating buildings. It just doesn't work that way.
Could you speculate on two things? What would have Ayn Rand thought about Ron Paul? Mm-hmm. And what would have Adam Smith thought of Ayn Rand?
Well, there's no question that she would have despised Ron Paul. You know, I don't know about the second one. I'd much rather answer the first one. She would, you know, it's hazardous enough putting, you know, myself in the place of Ayn Rand, much less Adam Smith. But she would have despised Ron Paul for the simple reason that she despised all libertarians. You know, any people who promulgated a point of view that was similar to her own, she despised. She thought they were ripping her off. So she was against libertarians, vehemently against libertarians, and she was also against the John Birch Society. You know, you either had to be under her wing, you know, you had to agree with her completely in every respect, or she didn't want to have anything to do with you in terms of, you know, in terms of your politics. And look, she didn't endorse Reagan. You know, she was against Reagan because of his activities. So she would have disliked Ron Paul because Ron Paul, among other things, as you know, like Reagan, Ron Paul opposes abortion, you know, very vociferously. So, she would have hated Ron Paul.
Even with his son?
I think she would have disliked anyone associated with Ron Paul. She would have disliked any libertarian. She just would. Rand Paul, yeah. Which is, by the way, not named after Ayn Rand. His name is Randall. That's sort of an urban legend. That is a genuine urban legend. His name was Randall.
I have a memory that Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden came to a parting of the ways.
Yes.
Was that personal or was that philosophical?
It was personal. Ayn Rand had 100% personal, although it was represented differently at the time. She had an affair with Nathaniel Branden. Nathaniel Branden was her principal deputy, and her ideological, her heir, as a matter of fact, roughly between the years 1952 and 1968. In 1968, there was a big split in the Rand movement. And the reason was because they'd been having an affair from around 1952 off and on, you know, through the 60s. And Nathaniel Branden wanted to break it off. And she didn't take kindly to that. So, I mean, this is all established history. In fact, there was a TV movie made about it about 20 years ago. This is, you know, even the objectivist movement acknowledges that they had an affair. So she made all kinds of accusations against him, all scurrilous accusations. It was a personal dispute. It gets back to the quote that I read from Nathaniel Branden about how, you know, the objectivist movement, how, you know, the objectivist movement doesn't always stay close to the facts.
What happened to him after that?
What's that again?
What happened to him after that?
Oh, he became a very successful, he was a psychologist, and he became a very successful author, writing self-help books. He got involved in, but his role in the objectivist movement really sort of ended, although he's kind of come back. He appears on panels. Right now he's kind of ill. He's in his 80s. But he just totally left the movement. But contrary to her wishes, you know, she put a curse on his head. Contrary to her wishes, he became a very successful author.
Thank you. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about Ayn Rand, and I think you described her as being the godmother of the Tea Party movement. Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more about your thinking in that regard?
Well, you have to understand about Ayn Rand is that you have to understand about the Tea Party is that it's a very disorganized movement. It's a little bit anarchic, but there are several main groups, and as I describe in the book, she was, you know, and you know, there's been a certain amount of publicity about how at Tea Party rallies, including the early Tea Party rallies, you'd see signs saying Ayn Rand is right and who is John Galt, you know, John Galt being a character from Atlas Shrugged. But what I found in my reporting was that Ayn Rand had been an important influence on early members of the Tea Party, including a man by the name of Mark Meckler, who is head of one of the major Tea Party groups. I mean, he's a very, very big Ayn Rand aficionado, and also Ayn Rand was an influence on other early members of the Tea Party. And you see this not just in their adoption of her point of view, not always all of her beliefs, but crucial parts of her belief system. You see this in the positions that Tea Party has taken. The Tea Party, for instance, is not very much into social issues. You don't see Tea Party members really pushing all that much on abortion or gay marriage. It's not their main thing. Their main thing is capitalism, and I think to a very large extent, is Rand's influence. I think.
I think there's a difference between the messenger and the message. And the thing is, it seems like still, whatever the perception of her message is, I think she still has the message has still broad appeal. And you can, pick certain things that you like or don't like. And just wondered, from your perspective, is her name, I sense her appeal growing or not? And it takes maybe many forms, and maybe people are also spinning it to their own use. But she is still, and we're talking about her.
Sure.
And so she herself, or that philosophy, still has some impact on what's happening.
Oh, there's
and
no
I just
question.
wondered
There's no question about that. And as a matter of fact, one of the things I did was interview a man by the name of Oliver Stone, the famous film director, who's, of course, this very, very far left guy, way out to the left. But Oliver Stone had a very interesting take on Ayn Rand. Oliver Stone, at one point, was going to do an adaptation of The Fountainhead. Because you see, it seems that The Fountainhead, the rights to The Fountainhead are still with Warner Brothers. She sold them to Warner Brothers in the 1940s, and they made a movie with Gary Cooper, which I personally like, but the critical reception was mixed. They still have the rights. And he was going to do another remake of Fountainhead. And he gave me, and in one of the final chapters, I get into the way he was going to manipulate the Fountainhead. And it's really kind of interesting because he was going to turn Howard Rourke from being a very selfish man into a selfless individual who acted for the people. And the way he described it, it's kind of interesting. At least I thought so. But my point is this. I think my point is that I think there are elements to Rand. Speaking personally, I personally find that there are elements to Rand's philosophy that are actually very appealing, that I personally like. I personally liked her novels, which I point out in the book. I thought they were readable. They were not great works of literature, but neither is Herman Wouk, for that matter, which, he was a big bestseller at about the same time. I thought her books weren't that bad. I didn't agree, obviously, with a lot of what she had to say. But there were elements of her philosophy, like individuality, that, I think she had a point there. And I think her point on selfishness, if you don't take everything she said completely, if you don't agree with everything 100%, certainly if you agree with 30% of what she says, you can take away certain things from her books that are positive, that are life-affirming. So, and I think there are elements, and I recommend that people read her book, but I also recommend that people sort of, read it selectively and try not to swallow what she said whole and try to do what Oliver Stone did, which was to sort of, adapt Rand, to sort of adapt her into your own belief system and not let her take over your belief system, which is what, unfortunately, I think a lot of, young people do when they read her books. And that's why I think it's unfortunate that her books are taught in high school. I think you have to be a bit older. I think you have to be at least in college to be able to really properly appreciate Ayn Rand. But to answer your question, I think there are definitely positive aspects to her books. There's just no question.
What would you say is the single most?
Oh, just a second. Wait for the microphone, please.
In your opinion, what would you say is the single most inconsistent internally inconsistent aspect of objectionalism?
Well,
Abjection.
where you see inconsistency is to me I see inconsistency less in the internal inconsistency, less in her philosophy than in the actions of Rand herself. Rand was, and the biggest example of that was Social Security, was actually not Social Security, it was Medicare. Rand was an opponent of Medicare. She was violently opposed to Medicare going back to long before Medicare was enacted. She was opposed to Medicare in newsletter articles during the Kennedy administration when Medicare was just trying to slug its way out. It was under a lot of opposition, and it was finally enacted in 1965. But she felt that Medicare would destroy the medical profession, that it would enslave doctors or words to that effect. That it was simply terrible things. But what happened when she qualified for Medicare, and she needed Medicare, and her husband needed Medicare? They signed up for it. And they signed up for Social Security, which I can kind of understand to a certain extent, which she also opposed. I kind of understand Social Security because she paid into it. But, Medicare, it was not quite the same thing. There might have been some deductions that she paid into Medicare, she just took advantage of this program that she described as an unalloyed evil. So that's where I think you see some inconsistencies.
Will you talk a little bit about how when you were interviewing Tea Party leaders, you found out that something about Rand struck a chord in their private lives, which made them glom on to her as a model?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question because it wasn't just the Tea Party leaders who I spoke to, but it was other people. It was people like Pamela Geller. One of the people I interviewed was Pamela Geller, who was a well-known blogger opposing the so-called Ground Zero Mosque. Pamela Geller, Mark Meckler, and some of the other Tea Party, and the Tea Party leaders, she's not a Tea Party leader, some of the Tea Party leaders who I spoke to, they all shared one sort of common denominator, which is that Rand appealed to them on a sort of a deep psychological level. For instance, Pamela Geller was a sort of a rebellious young lady. When she was in college, she wanted to leave home, and her parents wouldn't pay for her college education unless she stayed at home. So she left home and she supported herself. And she was introduced to Rand at around that time, and Rand resonated with her because it resonated with her. Because Rand, you see, in addition to the politics, in addition to the economics, in addition to everything that I think a lot of people object to about Rand, she was in favor of individuality, and she was in favor of speaking up for yourself, including speaking up for yourself with members of your own family. Now that appealed very much to Geller, because Pamela Geller came from a family that was kind of controlling, and you see characters in the Rand books, particularly in Atlas Shrugged, where several of the main characters, including the guy Hank Rearden, who's this steel magnate, and he's got this family of leeches, who are, honest to God, reading that book, I was totally, rooting for Hank Rearden. I didn't like the philosophy, but as a character, I rooted for Hank Rearden like everybody else. I rooted for Hank Rearden. And that's the kind of thing that appeals to people, I think, and I don't think it's really appreciated, that she really, she appeals, that Rand, speaks to people's, self-esteem, to self-esteem issues, psychological issues. And that's why for a while, and you don't really have it anymore, but that's for a while, during the 50s and 60s, it was almost becoming a branch of psychoanalysis, Randian psychology. There was a brief craze of Randian psychology, which you don't hear very much about anymore, and which was really, self-esteem. And she appealed to people's, self-esteem issues very much. And I think that's the kind of thing that's one of the things that gets people involved in Rand. Gentleman there.
Did you see the Atlas Shrugged movie that came out a year or two ago? And if so, do you have a view of it? Does it echo her philosophy, or does it come close to being like the book?
Well, there were several problems with that novel, with the movie. First, and the one for which it was criticized the most, and I happen to agree with it, is that it just wasn't a particularly well-made movie. I mean, even Rand acolytes, who were thrilled that they were making a movie about Atlas Shrugged, weren't really very happy with the performances or with the production values, which weren't, all that great. But the other problem is that it was sort of a multi-part. It was only one part. It was the very, very first part of the novel. So it had a problem with production values. Instead of being dystopian, it sort of moved into, instead of being set sort of in a 1950s dystopia, they moved it into the present day and made it a dystopia. They sort of screwed around a little bit with the time frame of the movie, and it just wasn't that well made. The production values weren't that great. So I would say that, I interviewed Yaron Brook, who was sort of lukewarm about the movie. To him, the thing about the movie, which the main test of the movie is, would it make people read Rand? And I would say the answer is no. Seeing that movie isn't going to make people read Rand, and it just was not a very good movie.
Oh, just one quick follow-up. Sure. I think when you say self-esteem, I think that's one of the thing that's appealing, I think.
Sure.
And it's almost a self-help book. And especially compared to what's happening now, if you look at government now, it's still dysfunctional. So you think, why not? And I think we're very interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, I did mention, in fact, yeah, it's funny you should say that, because in fact, somewhere in the book, I forget where, I say, it is one part self-help book. And that's really what it is. That's right. No question about it.
It's been said that the job of the Federal Reserve was to take away the punch bowl when things get a bit rowdy. Do you think what Alan Greenspan did was more in his self-interest by keeping interest rates low when he should have increased them because the party was getting rowdy around the year 2000 because he wanted to get one more appointment as chairman of the Federal Reserve from Bush? And he was also keeping the Democrats happy by keeping interest rates on the home loans low.
Yeah, that's an interesting theory. I mean, that's possible. What you're suggesting is possible. One of the reasons that Greenspan is not popular among some people is because of his actions on interest rates. But to me, the main thing that made Greenspan interesting from my perspective was not so much his actions on interest rates, but his actions on regulations, which I've gone into earlier. But I think what you're saying is entirely possible. It's just he was a very politically savvy person, and I think self-preservation might have been part of it. No question. Any other question? If not, thanks again for having me.
For more information, visit the author's website, gary-weiss.com.
Well, as you can see, there's a good-sized crowd here at the Jacob Javits Convention Center for Book Expo America, the annual book publishing industry's convention in New York City. And one of the publishers represented here is the Yale University Press. John Donatich is the director of that press. Mr. Donatich, we wanted to ask you about some of the books that are coming out this fall. I'm going to start with former Congressman Mickey Edwards has a new book coming out.
Yeah, Mickey Edwards is an interesting character. He started out as a congressman Republican from Oklahoma, and now he works for the Aspen Institute with some gigs in between at Princeton and Harvard. And he's taking a look at basically how our political process has been paralyzed by the bipartisanship, what we call bipartisanship, lack of tolerance for the political process right now. And he has a number of real practical steps he wants to suggest on how to fix the process. One, the House Speaker should not hold an office. He should actually denounce Marxist Party. That's one good thing. He thinks that all this sort of redistricting should be privatized and done with an independent council. So the book is an analysis of the problem as it stands and also a kind of way to fix it. So really interesting.
And he was a congressman back in the 80s, early 90s, and he's had quite the career ever since.
Yes, as I said, he's been at Princeton, he's been at Harvard. Right now he's a senior officer at the Aspen Institute, the think tank out in the Boulder area. So it's a pretty amazing career.
Mr. Donatich, Susan Jacoby is an author familiar to a lot of our viewers. She's been on our Book TV program several times. Another book by Susan Jacoby. What is it?
So this is a book about one of the sort of great atheists in the political process, Robert Ingersoll, who in the late 19th century actually ran for president and had a huge populist outcry of support for him. But the fact that he was an atheist and the fact that he was pushing a completely secular agenda pissed a lot of people off. And so his campaign was stopped short by people who had a real interest in preserving the church within the state. Susan Jacoby is no stranger to this topic. She did a book a few years ago called Free Thinkers. Ingersoll was a character in that book, and she was so fascinated by his story that she decided to do a proper book-length study of him. And I think it has a lot of resonance for the debate that's happening in the presidential election right now.
I wanted to ask you about an author that I am not familiar with, but a lot of our viewers will be. Wole Soyinka?
Wally Soyinka, yep. And there's Gali. Wally Soyinka is an incredible writer. This is one of my favorite books, I think, on the season. He's a Nobel laureate, won the Nobel Prize for his fiction and his playwright. And this is a book where he really wants to take a look at sort of the popular bias and the sort of global condescension that happens when people think about Africa. It's sort of, there was a famous book written several decades ago called Orientalism by Edward Said, when it took a look at how the West takes a look at the Middle East, basically, in the Far East, and he called it kind of an Orientalism. And I think that some of that perspective informs this book. It really is about sort of the Western glare or glance at Africa and how we sort of condescend to it, how we, even the sort of well-intentioned policies like reparations or land reparations or humanitarian aid has an air of condescension, as if the West needs Africa to be the sort of prick to our conscience in a way. And this is something that he's not really denouncing the intention. He's denouncing the sort of air of superiority that comes with it. And so that's one of the things that's really interesting about the book. He also thinks it's impossible for Westerners to understand Africa. It's not a hegemonic continent, by which I mean it's not one people, it's not one nation, it's not even several nations. The very idea of nation states as opposed to tribal states is a very Western concept, and which is at the root, I think, of a lot of misunderstandings that we have about Africa. So it's a book that doesn't rest easy with all our presumptions about what Africa is and challenges each of them. And to my mind, it's one of the most profound books about that continent I've ever read.
Do you know where he lives, and will he be touring the U.S.?
Well, that's complicated. He actually has an unpublished address. He's been the victim of life threats, basically. So he has a big security contingency when he travels. So we hope, in the meantime, though, he's had a lot of interest from major think tanks and theaters, and so we'll try to do some things. We'll do them very carefully with security, but I hope he'll say yes. He's done them before, so we have every good reason to think he'll do them again. So more to come on that.
John Donatich, how many books a year does Yale University Press publish? Are you a money-making venture? Are you associated with the university?
We're a department completely owned by the university. We are about a $32 million publisher, so we're sort of a middle-sized independent publisher. We publish in 4 different areas. We have an art list that is composed of a couple hundred books, and that is books that we produce. We also distribute and co-publish with about 26 museum partners, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Philadelphia Museum of Art, Art Institute of Chicago, National Gallery of London, and a couple of dozen others. And that's really a wonderful thing. We have a trade list, which most of the books we're talking about today are what we call crossover books, books that were written by people who have intellectual capacity but written for a wider audience. We have an academic imprint, which is purely research-driven and peer-to-peer business, really, kind of thing. And finally, a course book program. So all up, about 400.
As a small independent publisher, how has your life changed in the last couple of years? E-books, etc.
It's interesting. I think that in the last several years, it was more radical than it's been in the last year. I think things are sort of stabilizing. They're getting more predictable. The growth of e-books is not stratospheric anymore. It sort of seems to be steady and something we can get our arms around. We publish most of our pure text-driven, narrative-driven books simultaneously as ebooks and print books. Our art list, however, because of permissions issues and the intensive design of those books and the pure objectness of beautiful art books, those have not gone digital at all. So that's a real, interestingly print-bound medium, though we're experimenting with that.